Hey folks, welcome back. This week I decided to jump in on an old tag that seems to be getting another wave of love. I've seen at least 2 YouTubers that I follow jump in on this already, so I'll chuck their videos below. And this was a tag originally started by 𝗵𝗵𝗄𝗃, who used to be a huge part of the tarot community, but I believe continues to be a prolific book community member. So still shouting out Katie, because of course this was her creation. I really thought that I had done some form of this tag years ago. I actually can't find it. I may have just not been looking very well. I know that I did the sort of remix version with the top 10 indie decks and top 10 mass market, but I'm not sure that I actually did this one. Many know that I am in the process of moving, so the videos are very sporadic, just trying to get some fun ones filmed before I pack my decks away. So don't expect anything too heavy or groundbreaking anytime soon. But for the time being, one of the reasons I decided to come on and film this rather than just go through the process was actually some of the just brief insights that I got from actually going through my collection and asking myself this question, which is one of the reasons that I like to do this in the first place. There's quite a few tags that I mentally participate on, or with rather, that I don't then come on and record just for a myriad of reasons. But yeah, this is what we're doing today. So rather than jump straight into the decks, for those who are kind of fatigued of seeing the decks, I just feel like this bit may be the bit that people are most interested in. And like I said, it's nothing huge or groundbreaking, but what I added to the title was what really matters. And I mean what really matters if I personally were to drastically downsize, because I'm sitting at just over 100 decks in my collection. That's including every kind of deck. I am counting any Lenny decks or playing card Oracle decks that I've got. That's where I'm sitting, which is kind of a comfortable position for me given all of the things I've told people about why I have a larger amount of cards in the first place. If you haven't heard me discuss the why, I'm sure I can direct you to a video, or you can just ask in the comments below and I'll let you know. So if I were to hypothetically do a drastic downsize, one of the things that I noticed was helpful, and is one of the reasons I kind of do this on a regular basis anyway. If anyone knows me well by now, they'll know that I generally part with a good handful of decks every half a year to 12 months. Like, it's not a set period all the time, but what I mean is I genuinely have quite a good flow of parting with things and really sort of trying to keep tabs on what still holds value to me and my practice and what doesn't, what sort of had its time for whatever reason. Because of the size of my collection, I really don't like that to feel too stagnant. If it was a lot smaller, it probably wouldn't be something I would do so much, but given the size, that's something that I am particularly mindful of. I don't like things to just sit there that aren't really adding value. The value that they might add can differ, because with a larger collection like that, and because I do a lot of divination based things, so I'm not just reading for myself, I'm reading for others. I do the Patreon, so obviously I'm creating content for hopefully inspiration, sometimes resources as well, and well, often resources, but I guess sometimes you could call it teaching content. I don't really try and place myself in that, but at the same time I acknowledge that is a big portion of what I put out there. What else? I also use some of my cards in my therapeutic work with those clients as well. Not necessarily tarot so much, but more sort of oracles. They traverse quite a lot, and because I'm indoors a lot and with my health stuff, I tend to use them for other creative and artistic joys. So there's quite a plethora of things that these little boxes of cards touch, if that makes sense, or they have involvement with. That said, if they're not really reaching into any of those areas anymore, or the size becomes larger collection-wise than I would like it, then that's really when these types of processes, I find at least, are really interesting, because thoughts and tastes and values and practice ebbs and flows and changes and evolves over time. So naturally, the outer layer, especially of the collection and the tools that I use, also reflects that. It's interesting really identifying perhaps what the core is as well, and those things that remain mostly unchanged, and not in stasis, but I just mean the things like animal gnosis, animal medicine, animal messengers, working with the spirit of animals, and also working and engaging with wildlife and trying to have a hand in that in a very real and physical realm. That tends to be quite a constant over my whole entire life. So that would be an example of like a core facet that it still evolves, but it hasn't gone anywhere, and it doesn't really take time out, if that makes sense. So just to give like a bit of an example of what I would consider like a core layer, and then the outer layers. So as I went through the hypothetical question, one of the things that I feel the process is helpful with is identifying decks that I might be ready to move on, or really just in the process of, I suppose, adding value, priority, not necessarily like rating them from 1 to 100, but you get the general idea of it when you're going through, of what decks, if I wanted or needed to downside for any reason, what would be first on the chopping block. And that's something that I just note down, because most will also know that I'm quite a big note taker. You could call it journaling. The only difference is I predominantly do it on like Apple Notes, basically. Most of my journaling exists there. And that can be everything from tarot readings and card meanings, dream work, to simple things like this. I do love a list. And as my ever dwindling memory gets challenged by fatigue and cognitive impairment, the lists are more useful than one might imagine. So I have my lists, and that's where I put some of that information. But also when I was speaking about the process in Discord, which in the end is sort of what prompted this, and I wanted to have some stuff up before I disappear into the ether. So I'm really trying to not disappear for too long during the move, and also honour the fact that my body is getting more and more sore by the day, so we'll see. You've got a video this week. When I was talking to some folks in Discord about the process, one of the things I really noticed, and perhaps I should start by saying, out of the 100, what I had said was, I feel like I could sit pretty at 20, but even happier at 30. And I think that that's a really honest spot for me. No, you don't need that many decks. I don't need that many decks. This is not about need. We could get into a discussion about art and expression and need coming into that. And all I'm going to say is, think of films like Equilibrium. There's a much bigger discussion to be had there about art and creativity and needs versus wants. So to sort of move the conversation into the intention that I mean, as opposed to the very external, more consumerist way of viewing things. Because no, I don't need this many decks, and I could still happily enjoy mine in a far smaller selection. Do I use most of them? Yes, throughout the year, because of different projects that I do and offerings that I do throughout the year as well. So there is that, and that's not a standard experience for every tarot reader. So that's worth noting. I would argue that to say, well, we don't need any decks. Yes, technically that's true because a deck is not going to keep me alive. But there is, like I said, that discussion about sort of creative nourishment, and perhaps for some of us who might not be able to artistically express ourselves in other physical ways, seeing, interacting with art in some format, I would argue that there is a layer of need there. It's just not, it doesn't look like this, but it's just not as black and white as I feel some conversations allow for. I don't know if that's a good way of explaining that, but anyway, if I think, okay, well, the 20, still doing around 20 was moderately easy. Doing 10 was far more difficult. And why I say that is because unless I was that desperate for money, I wouldn't be taking myself down to 10. So I think that that's kind of a key point. And I really wanted to stay as close to 10 as possible for the tag and for time and the other stuff. But when I did think about the difference between, say, that 25 or 30 to 10, what I was talking to others about was how the importance of certain factors shifted quite significantly. Because one of the things that I really enjoy is really ingenuitive decks, the thinkers, the ones that have certain layers that really spark particular conversations and explorations. Now, it's not to say that the decks that I chose don't have that, but if we were weighing all these categories out, the real strong factors for me above everything else boiled down to what brought me joy and what is most reflective of me and my practice in this space, and as close to the core part of that practice as well, rather than the more outer part. Also, some of the decks, I realised that they're decks that I could work with the concepts more easily without the deck. So things like archetypes, it's already ingrained in all of the training I've done, and one of the lenses that I view the world's energy through, ones that have very emotion-focused things, like the Reclaim Oracle, absolutely brilliant, and one of the ones that I would use therapeutically in practice with clients, not just divination clients. But I don't need the deck to do that. And like I said, I don't need any of these decks to do these things, but some of the others add a different kind of merit, and it could just be the artwork in particular, or the connection that I have with it, or how it reflects my practice in a way that is harder to create by myself. So that was the thing that changed the most, and I just thought that that was something that would be interesting to come on and talk about, because I've discussed the lines between minimalism and maximalism and all that exists in between. I've discussed things like consumerism and our relationship with stuff, and I've done a fair amount of that over the years, perhaps not always the big bold video that just focuses on that one topic. Usually they're in and around several topics, or some of them are on Patreon, I'll grant you. But I've spoken to a lot of that over the years, but I like how those bigger topics show up in these sort of nuanced processes. And whilst this is another deck tag and just another thing like that, it was process-wise interesting for me. And I know from myself, because thankfully my memory did retain this information at least, that this has shifted in the recent years based on a couple of new decks. There are some very recognised and easy to guess ones as well. And this brings me to the decks then. So I have 10 decks. And those 10 decks include 2 decks that are so nostalgic to me and so sort of like grandfathered in when you've been doing something so long. These decks are so nostalgic to me. They're such an intrinsic part of the beginning of my practice that I wouldn't part with them just based on that. They really aren't, one of them in particular really isn't used that much in the last sort of year. But I will not part with it because of that, because it's pure nostalgia for me, and I don't have that much of a connection with material objects and tools as a whole. So it's interesting because then that adjusts that top 10 with these two decks that I do use them, but the relationship with them is such a long story and such a long evolution that things have come in that are more appropriate, more up to date, more in tune with my practice and me and where I live and who I am now. But I do have the other two that surprisingly were knocked out of this, and yet the reality is that they get used all the time. Arguably I could add a third in as well because it's on my altar right now and it's not in these 10. So I don't know, what do I do? Do I add an honourable mention at the end? That's the decision. But let's get into the 10. Surprising absolutely no one, and one of the two OG grandfather, grandmother, you know, been here forever decks. Also shout out to my runes, which are here, well actually here and there. I wouldn't be parting with my runes either, but this is a deck video, so fortunately I didn't have to bring that into the equation. So this is the Medicine Woman Tarot. This was one of two decks that I predominantly grew up with. There were others involved, but the most used, most common, and the ones that my mum used the most as well, because she was the very first person to introduce me to divination. So that was the medicine cards and the Mythic Tarot, which I don't have my original copy of. I have a copy of it, but me and that copy, we have some issues. Also, it's not the same as having a deck that I've literally had since childhood. It smells, like I've said to everyone a million times, of all of the incense and gosh knows whatever else it's been anointed with, touched with, in and around. It's a real sense-based experience for me. The card edges are softened. It's one of the ways that I envisioned tarot for a long time, and bearing in mind that I wasn't aware of the systems in that very structured way when I was introduced to tarot. Arguably Mythic Tarot and this are 𝗪𝗿𝗺𝗻𝗃, although this definitely gets far more inventive and stretchy and runs into other realms. Definitely not your kind of standard deck. I don't want to stick around on this one for too long just because I feel like people have heard me say a lot about it and I don't want to be too much of a bore. I don't know, this was a really gentle deck to come to, I feel, for a first deck. This softer, more land-based, more animal inclusive imagery, whilst not without its issues as it's aged and things. I feel like that was a lovely way to come to tarot, and I feel very fortunate in that regard. While this bag does not match the deck whatsoever, we're going into the other OG, and this is one of my favourite bags ever, which is why this deck is in here. Also, it's a great fit. This was by Moonlit Fae, so Jenna, and this is the home to my OG medicine cards. It's my first animal deck, so this is what I mean. When I watched, it was Jess's video where Jess included, I can't remember if it was just the 𝗪𝗿𝗺𝗻𝗃 now or whether there was another deck, but didn't include it in the 10 but said it was sort of like a given. And that's what I mean. These two are so much of a given that if I wanted to be cheeky... Now, this deck does still get used, but nowhere near as much as it would have years ago. And that's because there is a plethora of animal decks out there now. And I, not solely, but tend towards local animals more frequently. That said, I still do work with animals globally, and especially because I want to support my Patreons in exploring and accessing and connecting to animals in their region as well, I do try to stay somewhat global, somewhat worldwide, you know? So it does see use, but when this deck was out, there wasn't a lot of animal decks, and this is what I grew up using. So of course I had interaction with local wildlife and stuff, but this was the deck. This was the deck. And my mum absolutely loved this. I even think my nan, that's on the other side of the family, had a copy of it at some point. Of course, as time goes on and you develop and new decks come out, the thing is, this is very culturally framed. But in the grand scheme of things, even when we get into that, no two tribes are the same, and therefore this sort of generalized view that I might come to isn't going to know all of the nuances and know which is more generally agreed upon and which isn't. But what we can say is that it's not a monolith by any means. Also, these aren't all animals that I am in and around. So the foxes, albeit it wouldn't look like this, it would be a red fox. Swan, yes, very much local. Raccoon, no. And so because of that, other animal decks have come and they have inspired my practice in other ways. And honestly, I think that's where this one has had some more respite over the years. But it would be silly to ignore how much this influenced me, even as a really young child. And so this will forever have a spot in my heart and feel like something that I need to acknowledge as a part of my practice on a bigger scale. Moving into the rest of the decks, we shouldn't have any more noise interruption in the background. Let's move on, and apparently I'm showing boxes today. So the next deck you can see is the Antique Anatomy Tarot Ephemera edition. I have the first Antique Anatomy Tarot, which is completely different. I also have the mass market copy, which is very similar, but there are some changes, of course. So if you're looking at this and you're like, it's out of print, firstly, I'm not here trying to sell you decks. Number one rule to remember. But secondly, if you are wanting this, you know, shout out to my buddy, Claire, because we want her to do well and good things to come her way. This is a mass market deck now. Over in the UK, though, it's called the Modern Tarot Reader. But anyway, this would be the copy. And the Antique Anatomy Tarot is just an absolute staple. It is, above all, my absolute favourite pip deck, which did knock out some others. I think probably notably the Marigold Tarot, because I absolutely adore that, but not more than this. I will add that on the mass market version, on the bottles, they have labels which give you a little bit more of a suggestion towards some of their meaning. So like I can't remember what the 6 has on it, but I know the 5 of Cups has like cyanide and morphine. So there are some of the minor nuanced changes that you would be seeing if you got a mass market copy. And I use my mass market copy a lot for other people. There's no hard and fast rule with me, like I'm pretty chilled out, but this is generally my copy. And I prefer the originals just because that's what I bonded with. Again, minor changes, but like the High Priestess, I think the Empress and Emperor, slight adjustments, the High Priestess a little bit more noticeable. But anyway, one of the reasons that I love this deck is because I love everything skeletons, anatomical, vintage. I love that whole meeting of things. It's very apparent in my tastes across the board with artwork and some, I guess, some movie stuff, things that I used to draw. Yeah, just all of it. It's a really good representation of taste, of aesthetic. Look, we do have things here: snake oil, brain juice, magic eye tonic, but they have changed. The labels have changed significantly from one deck to another. I just feel like, whilst being spacious, the mixture of all of these things that I feel very familiar and bonded to, and the colour of the flowers, which I've said time and time again, it speaks to me a lot in a really beautiful, intuitive way that adds quite a lot of value into the way that I enjoy reading, It gives me the space to read in that very intricative way that I like, with infusions of most predominantly the elements and numerology, but also with a little bit of that 𝗪𝗿𝗺𝗏 and a little bit of, you know, here, there and everywhere really, because even some of my favourite teachers that I've learnt from, I wouldn't say that they're all solely set within a system themselves either. So I feel like this deck lets me really be me in the way that I read, more than some of my others, because I do like to honour the art that I'm seeing in the visual, especially when I'm reading for someone else. When I'm reading for myself, I'll play a little bit more fast and loose with that, but also I have usually picked the deck for a reason. I'm drawn to it. It's, you know, there's a flavour there. If I only had one deck, then I would read it the way that I read, and I might not always allow the artwork to take up so much space. But because I have more than one, that is a significant factor, and it's not really one that I have to think about too much with this, and yet the symbolism and the things that are included in here add a lot of value. I got the full in a piece that I'll be doing on Patreon, where I do like an in-practice reading, and not only do I read all about the full from that card and that position, but also the fact that the foot and leg come into it is something that is very relevant to that reading. So I don't want to give too many other spoilers away. There's just all of those layers in here, but with the spaciousness, and that's the word that I come back to a lot. And this is one that if I'm going to use a tarot deck, not my usual oracle, to do any sort of communication with spirit in particular, this again is another go-to one for me. It's just a very me deck as well, and I think, like I said, it's not just a reflection of my practice, it's also a reflection of my joy and my tastes, and all of those things wrapped into one. The things that spark my intuition, like the colours, like the key symbols in this, they're all things that make the most sense to me. So of course this is then a very highly regarded deck in my practice for that reason. This and the next one, for obvious reason, just really feed into all of those areas. So it does the more ingenuitive layers, because I think that it's done in a really clever capacity, the way that these pips are put together, especially as they're not necessarily 𝗪𝗍𝗍 layouts, but it never feels to me that they're just 6 rods, you know, 9 blades just flung on here. Design has gone into this deck still, and yeah, just all of the good stuff that I enjoy. So it hits all of those factors I was thinking about. So I don't have the box for this chunker, and this is another 𝗪𝗿𝗄𝗏 deck, aka Black and the Moon. There is more of this deck in other parts of my space, but this is the working version of this. So this is the Memento Mori Oracle. I mean, what can I say about this deck that I haven't already said? Is it a great reflection of my practice? Yes. Is it great for spirit work? Yes. Ancestral stuff, I mean, I would put that into the spirit work anyway. The animal gnosis, the elemental, I mean, it did remind me because 2 of those are there. The symbolism, the things that I use in my practice, because I've very much tailored this deck to reflect that as well, which is one of the absolute beauties of this and the expansions, is that it's so much become my own thing that I feel like if myself and 10 other people who had this deck sat down, all of our decks would be different. And I kind of love that, and also how we relate to these symbols. I know that's a given with anything. There's nuances when we read tarot, but the expansiveness of symbol in itself, which is far freer from the structure that tarot exists within, is just, yeah, it's so incredibly vast, and I enjoy it so freaking much. Never did I think I would be so bonded to an oracle deck that didn't have keywords other than the medicine cards, because honestly, I do value keywords. I never feel boxed in by them. I just find them useful. I enjoy them, and certainly there are a lot of decks that have titles that I find to be so obscure that I could read from them if I wanted, but honestly it's not my thing. But this is just quintessential craft for me now. I'm absolutely biased as hell, and not because of Claire, although if you're watching, I love you. But I am just like literally biased because of my experience with it. I have read for only several others with this deck, but I have. It is an energy and almost entity in and of itself. It's a really interesting relationship that I have with this one. Several of the oracles in particular that are included in this top 10, that is a very familiar occurrence. So I will say now that there are at least 2 more. So yeah, I love this deck. I have done a big video about it. I have done even bigger videos about it on Patreon. I have done videos about it on my Instagram, like long ones. So yeah, I don't know what else to say because we would be here for ages, and this, considering it was just meant to be, ooh, it's a top 10, I've got a little chatty, so we'll honour it. But yeah, just good stuff. Surprising no one. We have the Wild Unknown Tarot. This is the 2nd edition indie, and it is one that I have both indie copies of, but I actually got the 2nd before the 1st, and this is the one that I am most bonded with. And I don't commonly do that, but I do for just a couple of favourites. So yeah, this is the Wild Unknown. I didn't know that this deck was a thing like it was, which I'm glad about, because fortunately that then didn't have any sway on my experience with it whatsoever, other than if I had known that, perhaps someone would have told me, you know what, Tegan, don't try and learn the 𝗪𝗿𝗺𝗺𝗺 with this because it won't make sense. You can make it make sense, but if you're looking to learn the 𝗪𝗿𝗺𝗺𝗺 as someone who came to tarot in a far more storytell, intuitive basis, not that I didn't use 𝗪𝗿𝗺𝗺𝗺 decks, but as I say, I wasn't taught the system in that way. It's probably more helpful to start with one that the scenes are very much depicting what the meanings are. This does it enough, in fairness. I mean, if this doesn't give me the usual 𝗪𝗿𝗺𝗺𝗺 3 of Swords, then I don't know what does. I do like that it's the bloodied ribbon as opposed to the heart, because I feel like it gives me more of a reflection of how I read the 3 of Swords, and the fact that it is it's more for me a discussion of the relationship between the meeting of our emotions and our intellect and our whole sort of mental framework, and how we communicate that with ourselves and others. So they would be sort of like the 3 facets, although you could argue like the mind, intellect, it's kind of the one thing, but in terms of like intellect versus communication, and then how our emotions and feelings sort of come together to influence that, and influence doesn't always have to be bad, and also we learn from that as well. So without harping on about card meanings, the Wild Unknown Tarot is, I'm glad that I found it before I realised it was some kind of trendy deck. I don't know. It seems to have suffered in many people's opinions just based on it being considered a trendy deck. And I understand in terms of like a larger community thing about how trends can have an impact on the community, especially now given how much social media seems to have a sway over what's created or how it's created. But it's just an interesting discussion to me, and all of that said, I really don't mind when people absolutely loathe it, because it doesn't impact my relationship with this, and I would never expect everyone to love a deck just because I like it. Well, I say I like it, I do very much love this deck. I've said before, so the other classic things are that there weren't people in it, and I found that really refreshing. I hadn't seen a tarot deck that was like this ever, especially not one so animal based, especially not one that had this style that I was completely besotted with. the very specific colour choices, just the framing of it. I feel like the 𝗏𝗏𝗃s actually helped me eventually in a way that people 𝗏𝗏𝗃s hadn't, because of the way that I was introduced to them and the struggles that I had with 𝗏𝗏𝗃 cards in particular. And this is a deck that when I think of tarot, when I think of the Ten of Wands, when I think of the Sun, this is one of the images that come up. My imaginations are very picture based in particular, and some of my sense memories are quite strong as well. And so I can imagine the 𝗪𝗏𝗍𝗂 because I studied it so much in the end, but also this comes up in my mind. So it's basically how I imagine tarot. It has inspired poetry. It has taught me to read tarot in many different ways and stretch much further than I ever sort of anticipated. And I'm really bonded with this deck. It very much has taken on its own shape for me. So I just love this deck and will continue to be a cliche because that's not going to change. Next up, we have a boxless one, and this is the Faeries Oracle by Brian Froud. And another interesting note, I think, with some of these favourites is they're not necessarily the most used. I mean, there's only so much you can use and get through these decks, right? But also, the Memento Mori Oracle is the most used Oracle deck in my collection as stands, which is very visible on the wear. This isn't as used necessarily, but like I say, push comes to shove, this is up there. This is my fairy deck for all of the potential imperfections perceived by others or myself. I feel like this deck inspired me earlier than I would have even thought about it, but it inspired me to return to belief beyond proof at one point because of a lot of damaging experiences that I had within spiritual communities and facets of anything to do with belief, religion or otherwise, and set practices, as well as enjoyable, fun, nourishing ones. And I fell into a very scientific, factual, proof-based mindset. And in that sense protected a part of myself, and in another sense lost a part of myself. And the Faeries Oracle inspired its return, and whilst it didn't directly lead me to returning towards a more animistic way of seeing the world, engaging with the world and my belief and values, it probably was a seed, and a really significant one, which I hadn't really put together until more recently, because arguably there are other things, like more people were talking about animism, and the more I worked with land spirits and the Fae and things like that, it all sort of came together. It wasn't an isolated event. It didn't happen in sort of like my own echo chamber. It was definitely influenced by community and the people that I was around at the time, some of whom I still am, some of whom I'm not. But it definitely, all of those things sort of gifted me something in practice. Belief beyond proof, and that's what I call it. And the Fae mean a lot to me, and even if I don't see them all this way, because I've often said, oh, this is how I view the Fae the most, and it is, and I really enjoy the singers for that, because I see energy as something less human, less animal, just less recognizable. And so actually the singers are kind of a big deal for me in this, although I know they kind of bore others. But what I will say is, with the very human women looking Fae, I find there to be then a lot less diversity than the rest of the Fae. It's like this is the most diverse I've seen, but there is enough human influence in here to then get into a bit of a cultural argument about representation still. You know, nothing is perfect, so it's just something that I acknowledge. Aside from that, I feel like this is the closest that I get. Oh, this gives me Pan's Labyrinth. If you know, you know. If you don't, or you don't agree, that's fine. And then, of course, this for more obvious reasons, this is totally a gelfling and what I model my bangs off of. So I've had some really, I will say, profound experiences with this, because I'm not going to pretend that it wasn't. I am fortunate. I do own the other Fairy Oracle that they created. Well, Brian Fowden created with his wife, but honestly, this is my favourite. So yeah, I love the other one, but push comes to shove, this is my pal. And so technically, if I don't include the other two honourable mentions, this knocked out the Brady Tarot. It did. It knocked out the Brady Tarot. This is the Forest Law Tarot. It's massively out of print, by the way. And the reason, and I don't know that they're comparable because they're very different. So really, you've only got left, in my reasoning and my comparison, the reasoning is very simply because this is a reflection of my native region. The land that I live on, the plants and trees that I see every day, mostly the animals that I see frequently enough, and the wonderfully inventive, beautifully thought out and consciously created Brady Tarot is not. It's not. It's North American. And this is arguably fitting for a significant portion of Europe, but the creator is British and so am I. So this is my landscape, this is home, this is familiar. That's why, because they're very different. There is a lot more visual symbolism included in the Brady Tarot. Not that I would ever compare these, but if we were going to do like an unfair comparison based on them both being absolutely beloved and top decks in my collection, an unfair comparison would be that this one is more of a relationship between a plant and an animal, and that one has a little bit more of a scene being offered and the keywords. But this is home. It's that damn simple. And I love it. And if she ever brings it back into print, I will get myself a second copy. I am a little bit precious about this one, which is, like I said, not something I enjoy. But I have the best time with this deck because it is a reflection of animal gnosis for me and all that contains. And for anyone who's not familiar, I did a video, but I will just briefly say the reason that I chose that term is because it was an attempt, I'm not saying it's fully successful, but an attempt to incorporate the fact that whilst I work with animals on the more spirit, magic and witchcraft related plane, I also very much engage myself in local charities and rescues and animal studies, including any zoology information I can make sense of or teach myself, education, awareness, all of the things. So it traverses both of those, the spirit and the physical, so that I don't feel like I've turned them into just a nice little symbol for me to bounce off of and have no attachment, appreciation or recognition for the real living thing. So that's what I mean by this, and this deck brings all of that into my realm, and animals make a great deal of sense to me in tarot because, of course, that's just kind of one of my things over the years. The trees has been a little bit more of a learning process, but the book is amazing as well. It's really well researched. I've never looked at it through a massively critical lens in terms of the tarot meets the research and how it all comes together, but from everything I've read so far, I've been pleased. And yeah, freaking love this deck, basically. Next up, we have a boxless one because they're in a bag, and this is the Fallen Angels Oracle. I feel like I've spoken about this recently, but I can't remember if it was here or not. It's one of the others that I was mentioning when I said the Memento Mori feels like it has an energy in and of itself. And it has been wonderfully challenging but wildly soft, like surprisingly so. I've said it before, I appreciate it's not new information. There is a real mixture of my taste and some of the, I feel like it sees some of the turmoil over the years in me, and perhaps that's because some of the most difficult ages that I experienced were when I was old enough to sort of take myself off to the local cemetery, and that's where I would hang out because I was just that kid who was my father's daughter, for better or for worse. It's funny how it evolves and how I used to hang out there and not really think about why I felt comfortable there or why I wanted to be there, but was there anyway nevertheless. And one thing that you get with cemeteries is, of course, a lot of animals chilling out as well, because it's quiet and peaceful, and it's quite powerful to have all of that energy together. And all of the people who come and visit it, it just feels like a tangible collective thing. The more we kind of, I'm going to say, dishonour the land and give it away, take from wildlife, the more important it is for wildlife to have these spots that still exist. So I feel like this, in a weird way, it sort of sees that as well as being a group of beings that I work with anyway. And all of the ones that I say where they feel like they've got an energy in and of themselves. Not that I don't bring reverence to all of my stuff, but these ones in particular, there is a lot of respect there. So I love this deck. Visually, it does a lot for me because of the wander that I took you on. But the readings that I get with it as well, it's just been a gem, and never did I think that this was going to be in my collection, let alone be in the top 10, but there you have it. Things surprise you, so yeah, it's a really good time, and one that's hard to articulate beyond sort of repeating what I've already said, which is one of the difficulties, I guess, with talking about some of these beloved decks, is that, is there anything new I can add? It was a reservation of mine, but hopefully this is enjoyable still. So this is where we get into 𝗪𝗁𝗍 territory, because this is very new to me. 𝗪𝗁𝗍 as far as this sort of fun creation goes anyway. And I did do 5 tarot and 5 oracle, so we've not got to the oracle yet, but this is the one that caused the most issues. The reason being is because I'd already knocked the Brady Tarot out, which, as you can imagine, is one of the 2 honourable mentions. But in reality, I don't think that this collection would be less than 12 to 13. But at a real damn push, it would be 11. And that's because, whilst this is definitely in the top, I don't think that I would ever part with this. Ever, ever, ever. And if anyone knows, my Tarot of Pagan Cats has been in the tops because it's awesome and I freaking love cats. Absolutely love them. When you get into like my top favourites, even that's dicey. Like, trying to whittle that down to even 5 top animals is difficult, but I can tell you my top 3 are foxes, cats and pigeons. And my stepmum bought me this for this birthday, so my 36th birthday, because I'm a giant child. For those who didn't watch the recent video, I will just recap, and for those who did, I'll be quick. Pigeons are a bond between my stepmum and I. We have rescued many. We have many a fun, silly, surprising story about pigeon rescues. We also have some sad ones and have done probably an equally fair share of pigeon burials. I say burials, laying them to rest, not actually digging. And, you know, seeing them and witnessing them. And I've done that for a lot of animals over the years, but pigeon finds us in an uncanny way. It's happened so many more times than any other animal other than cats, but obviously cats are domestic, so there's that layer. Although, look at the history of pigeons and what we freaking did to them, how they went from being sort of useful to us to then not. And it's like they were treasured and then they become what the rats of the sky, and I take issue with that as well because I love rats, so as someone who's owned them, it's a whole thing. Me and animals that are considered vermin are very bonded, just across the board, which is why, again, I'm so fond of creepy crawlies and insects. Just like the bad human name that we give certain animals is an issue. But anyway, I never thought I would have a pigeon deck. This is so wildly 𝗪𝗿𝗺𝗺𝗃, it's unreal, but it does make it a very easy reader in terms of I know 𝗪𝗿𝗺𝗺𝗃, and therefore I just honour that system when I read with this deck. I have already had wonderful readings with it. I am so in love with it because I do love the art style. It is very me. This is very feral city pigeon, which is very familiar to many of my experiences. These are things that I am familiar with seeing pigeons do, although I have never seen this. But this is the cutest strength card. Is it not hilarious? And yeah, the death card, it gets me every time because we've so done this, especially with the daisy chain. It just, there is so much nostalgia and memory that has actually nothing to do with the creators of this or what they've put in, other than the fact that this is very, I would argue, as true to pigeons as you possibly could get for like a very cutesy, playful sort of 𝗪𝗿𝗺𝗺𝗃 deck. And I was really surprised she got me this. She shouldn't have. It cost too much money to get it over here, in my humble opinion. I am eternally grateful. It's up there now, you know, it's bonded because I've had such a good initial experience with it, and the grungy colours are very me. So, you know, I enjoy colour and I like the infusion of it in the other decks that I spoke about, but of course this is kind of my vibe. I'm forever a grunger, let's just say it. I just would absolutely wax lyrically about this. But there isn't a comparison between this and my tarot of Pagan cats, and so I think for that reason it has to be in, and I'm going to put it in the end because I enjoy doing the 10 deck things, but I also want to be like really honest with where I'm at. And so the last oracle of the official 10, 11, that pushed off the Woodland Wardens. Yes, Coastal Curiosities. Again, a deck I fell for before I became friends with the creator, but it is by 𝗪𝗺𝗺𝗺𝗃. And I think the beauty of this one is, like the Memento Mori deck, has so much more versatility and feels like more of a rounded reflection of my practice than the Woodland Wardens. And so that's why. It absolutely knocked it. And as that deck is always out. It is here right now. This is on display because this is who we're working with on Patreon this month. But the Coastal Curiosities, considering I don't live by the coast, might I add, I have lived by a coast before and have very fond memories of it actually. Hi Bat. See, Bat's in there. There's a really interesting selection of animals in here, often several. And then it has that inclusion of like key items and tools and symbols, which brings in a little bit of that Memento Mori. I'm still connected with the plants and familiar enough with some of the coastal stuff. I mean, brambles, I'm going back to my brambles. There's just a lot more of my practice in this one, and I'll be honest, this is another one of those decks where it definitely had to be in here because sometimes when I use the decks that you're seeing, I suppose Little Pigeon Tarot is really new, but aside from that, I work with them for longer and I have a harder time putting them away to make space for other ones. And I say harder in that, you know, they're always at the forefront of my mind in terms of what decks would be really good for this or this or this or this. I just feel like I know them inside out, what they do well, what their strengths are. I find this to be so incredibly versatile. I love the keyword selection. I think that it's a really interesting selection actually. And as far as colour goes, if I'm going to be colourful, this is my kind of jam because I love the wallpaper or fabrics in the background so much. I don't really have anything bad to say about this deck other than the greedy part of me wants more. It does. Of course. Not a deck that's too big to shuffle, mind you, and there is a great amount of cards in this, which is another thing you'll notice in my Oracle decks. The key choices are, I want to say, all over 50. I have the best time with this, and it is a good all-rounder, and it's a lot of these decks work really well together, which, whilst that isn't the biggest deal, it's kind of known that I really enjoy pairing decks. It's not always tarot and oracle. Sometimes it's tarot and tarot. Even more often, it's oracle and oracle. These all just complement each other in beautiful ways, which I've just stopped and looked and I'm like, yeah, the medicine cards just don't match anything. But other than that, this is a whole visual mood throughout, which I hadn't really paid attention to before. But yeah, Coastal Curiosities, it is. And I will add, but only because I know, and someone was asking the other day, Lennox has had some mini ones printed, and I think as I record this there are still some in stock. So that was my 10, but as I say, I'm going to go to 11 because it's just it's not realistic otherwise. It's not my truth. I don't know. I've stretched my boundary. I'm fine with it. This is Tarot of Pagan Cats. It's such a solid reader. I travel with it if I travel. This one's been to Greece with me, actually. Not the most recent time, the time before. It is an absolute kiss to my soul because I've always been a little cat lady ever since I was born. I was born into a home of 9 cats. Not a stinky cat home, mind you, but we did have 9 cats. Several of them were very much my protectors and guardians as well, which is funny. Just all of the memories of all of the cats and my absolute love of them over the time that I've been in existence, and I adore it. And the fact that this cat lover got old enough to see a kitty cat tarot deck, but not one, many, has been just a deep joy. All that to say that this deck has been spoken about possibly more than most of the others. It's got my favourite devil card because it's ridiculous and it makes zero sense, and there is no way that you can keep a straight face when you look at it. It's the kitty cat tarot of my heart, and I've had a few cat decks and have more on my list, but this is the one that trumps them all. And in the grand scheme of things, even if I didn't include the Brady and the Woodland Wardens, which would be an absolute damn shame, so they are the other 2 honourable mentions, which I have mentioned both anyway, and you've seen one of the Woodland Wardens, so just to show one of the Brady Tarot cards here. Oh, sad. Oh, apparently I picked up 2. One of my favourites. That is the Brady Tarot, and in the grand scheme of things, that would be my 13, which is funny because I've been right into 13 in my seasonal deck choices. I'm not choosing pigeons versus cats. I won't do it. And therein lies my very long version of this video, but hey ho, hopefully it was fun. I reckon I may be lucky. I might be able to get hopefully one more video done, maybe 2. I don't think 2, but we'll see. There it is. Let me know what you think. Bye.